Let me ask you something, and I want you to really sit with this for a second. When a man starts ignoring you, when the texts slow down, when he stops calling, when you can feel that distance creeping in, what's the first thing that goes through your mind? Be honest. Because for most women, that first instinct is to do something, to reach out, to check in, to say, hey, are you okay? Or did I do something wrong? Maybe you scroll back through your messages trying to find the moment it shifted. Maybe you soften your tone. Maybe you give him a little more of your attention, hoping that closes the gap. And I get it. I genuinely do. Because when someone you care about goes quiet, the silence feels like a statement. It feels like rejection. And the human brain, especially when it's attached to someone, will do almost anything to make that feeling stop. But here's what nobody tells you. Here's the thing that the mainstream dating advice gets completely wrong. That instinct, that pull to reach out, to fix, to smooth things over, that's not love talking. That's anxiety talking. And when you act on it, you don't pull him closer. You hand him something he wasn't even sure he had. You hand him the upper hand. And the moment a man realizes he can go quiet and you come running, consciously or not, something shifts in how he sees you. And it rarely shifts in your favor. So today we're going to talk about what actually happens when you flip the script. Not in a manipulative way, not in a game playing way, but in a way that is rooted in genuine self-respect, real psychology, and the kind of energy that actually makes a man reconsider and sometimes completely break the pattern he was running. Because the truth is, the most powerful thing you can do when a man ignores you is almost the opposite of what you feel like doing. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why that is and exactly what to do instead. Welcome back to Love Psychology Secrets, where we don't do sugarcoating, we don't do toxic advice, and we don't do surface level takes. If you're here because you're serious about understanding yourself, understanding men, and building the kind of love that's actually built on something real, then this is your space. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a like on this video if you're even a little bit curious about where this is going. I promise you, it's worth it. Now, before we get into the practical side of this, I need to lay some groundwork. Because a lot of people are going to hear the title of this video and think, okay, this is going to be some revenge fantasy content about making him suffer. And that is not what this is. I'm not interested in helping you play games. What I am interested in is helping you understand the psychology of what's actually happening when a man goes cold. Because once you understand that, the right response becomes obvious. You stop reacting from emotion and you start moving from a place of genuine power. Here's the thing most people get wrong about being ignored. They treat it as a communication failure. Like, he stopped talking to me, so clearly there's a message being sent and I need to decode it and respond to it. But that framing puts you in a passive position from the jump. It makes his behavior the center of the equation, and your job becomes to interpret and react. And here's the problem with that. The moment you're reacting to him, you're operating on his timeline, in his frame, according to his rhythm. And that is exactly the dynamic that leads women to feel stuck, anxious, and like they keep losing ground in situations they never asked to be in. What's actually happening when a man ignores you is one of a few different things. And we need to be honest about all of them because lumping them together does you a disservice. Sometimes a man goes quiet because life genuinely gets heavy. Work pressure, family stress, mental weight he doesn't know how to talk about yet. Men, more often than women, tend to go inward when they're overwhelmed. They withdraw not to send a message, but because they don't have the emotional vocabulary in that moment to explain what's happening. That's a real thing, and it's worth understanding. That's not ego. That's not power. That's just the way a lot of men were wired, often since boyhood, to handle difficulty alone. But that's not who this video is primarily for. Because if a man is genuinely going through something heavy and he has communicated that to you in some form, and the distance has a clear and understandable context, that is a very different situation. That requires patience and grace, not strategy. Who this video is for is the woman who is dealing with the other kind of withdrawal. The kind that comes with no explanation. The kind that coincidentally shows up right after you showed some vulnerability, or right after you brought up something serious, or, and this is a very specific pattern, right after he sensed that your investment in him was higher than his investment in you. That kind of withdrawal is not accidental. It's not random. It is almost always a test, conscious or unconscious, of what you will do. And your response to that test determines a lot about how the dynamic between the two of you develops going forward. Think about it like this. You know how in business, the moment a salesperson can tell you really want the product, they stop negotiating? The price doesn't move, the urgency doesn't shift, because they know the deal is basically already made. Your enthusiasm just removed their need to work for it. The same psychology plays out in attraction. When a man senses that you're all in while he's only half in, especially in the early stages, the incentive to pursue, to invest, to try harder drops significantly. Not because he's a bad person necessarily, but because human beings, men and women alike, tend to value things that require some effort to obtain. That's not cynical, that's just how psychology works. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Most women, when they sense that withdrawal starting, do something that is completely counterintuitive to what they actually want. They increase their investment. They text more. They become more available. They become warmer, softer, more accommodating. And I understand the logic. It's like if there's a gap, fill it. If something is cooling down, add heat. But what that actually communicates at a subconscious level is that his withdrawal worked. That pulling back got a response. And that is a conditioning pattern you don't want to start. Because once that loop runs even 2 or 3 times, he pulls back, you reach out, the tension releases, it becomes a dynamic. And a dynamic is very hard to break once it's established. So let's talk about what you actually do instead. And I want to go through this carefully because there are layers here and each one matters. The first and most important thing you need to understand is this. Silence is only uncomfortable if you're the one who needs it to end. Think about that. When a man goes quiet, the discomfort you feel comes from your attachment to an outcome, specifically the outcome of reconnection. You want the warmth back. You want the contact back. And the anxiety you feel is your nervous system's way of pushing you to do something about it. But what if you didn't? What if instead of trying to end the silence, you just let it exist? Not as a punishment, not as a counter game, but genuinely because you decided, maybe for the first time, that you are not available for a dynamic where you do the emotional labor of keeping connection alive while he coasts. I was working with a woman a while back. Let's call her Priya. And she came to me completely torn up over a man who had been consistently inconsistent with her for about 3 months. Good weeks followed by gone weekends. Texts that felt warm and then suddenly short. She had convinced herself that if she was just more patient, more understanding, more flexible, he would eventually settle into something stable. And what I asked her was simple. I said, what do you think would happen if you just stopped reaching out for 2 weeks? And she looked at me like I had suggested something dangerous, like the relationship would evaporate. And I said, that's important information. Because if the only thing keeping this connection alive is your consistent effort to maintain it, then you don't actually have a relationship. You have a role you've been cast in. She did it. She pulled back. She stopped initiating. She stopped being the one to check in. And you know what happened? About 9 days in, he texted. And not a short text, a real one. Hey, I've been thinking about you text. Because the silence she created made space for him to notice the absence of something he had been taking for granted. Now, I'm not telling you this as a guaranteed formula. Every situation is different and every person is different. But the psychology behind it is consistent. People pursue what they feel they might lose. And when you're always available, always reaching out, always there, there's nothing to pursue. There's no question about where you stand. And unfortunately, certainty too early can kill the energy of pursuit faster than anything else. The second thing I want you to understand is about ego. Specifically, what happens to a man's ego when the thing he expected to happen doesn't happen. Because here's what a lot of men, not all men, but a certain type of man are actually doing when they go quiet. They are running what I call a compliance check. And a compliance check, consciously or not, is essentially testing whether you will conform to the dynamic they're setting. It's a power move disguised as disinterest. He pulls back to see if you'll come forward. And if you do, if you reach out, if you apologize, if you make yourself smaller to close the gap, the compliance check passed. He now knows that going cold is a lever he can pull. And men who figure that out early tend to pull it again and again. But what happens when the compliance check fails? What happens when he goes quiet and you don't react? When you don't reach out? When you don't double text? When you don't post something sad on your story or send a, hey, just checking in message? What happens is something he was not prepared for because his ego was expecting a certain response and it didn't come. And the absence of that response, that's the thing that actually lands. That's what creates real reflection in a man who was testing you. Not your words, not a confrontation, not an ultimatum delivered in the heat of frustration. The quiet confidence of someone who doesn't chase. I want to be very clear about something here because I know how this can sound. I'm not saying become cold. I'm not saying punish him or play games or manufacture distance to manipulate a result. What I am saying is that your natural response to someone who is withdrawing from you should not automatically be to close that gap at the cost of your own dignity. Because here's the thing about dignity. Once you compromise it in how you show up to someone, they can feel it. They may not be able to name it, but they feel it. And it shifts how they see you in a way that is very hard to undo. Now let's go deeper, because there's something that lives underneath all of this that I think is the real core of why this pattern plays out the way it does. And it has to do with what I call the value anchor. Your value anchor is essentially the internal standard you hold for how you deserve to be treated. And when that anchor is strong, when you genuinely believe in your bones that your time, your energy, your attention, and your affection are things of real worth, you don't chase people who go quiet. Not because you're playing a game, but because you actually understand that your energy is a resource, and you naturally stop pouring it into places that aren't giving it back. But when that anchor is weak, when your sense of your own worth is tied to his approval, his attention, his pursuit, then his withdrawal feels like a verdict. It feels like confirmation of a fear you were already carrying. And you chase not to win him back, but to disprove that fear. And the tragedy of that is that it almost always does the opposite. Because chasing from a place of insecurity is something people can sense. It reads as desperation even when it looks like affection. And it confirms in his mind that he has something you don't, which makes him feel less compelled to value what he already has. So let me ask you something real. When you've been in that position, when you've reached out to someone who was pulling back, what were you really looking for? Were you looking for them, or were you looking for relief from the anxiety of not knowing? Because those are two very different things. And understanding the difference is what separates reactive behavior from intentional behavior. Here's a mindset shift I want to plant in your head right now, and I want you to let it sit there and grow. Attention is not a substitute for intention. Say that again. Attention is not a substitute for intention. A man who loves and values you will show up consistently, not perfectly, no one is perfect, but consistently, with warmth, with presence, with follow through. And when he goes quiet, it's for reasons he communicates, not mysteries he creates. But a man who is running power dynamics, testing your limits, or simply not invested enough, he will use your craving for his attention as a substitute for actually showing up. He will sprinkle just enough contact to keep you engaged without ever giving you the consistency you deserve. And if you're not careful, you will spend months, sometimes years, mistaking the highs of his intermittent attention for actual love. I want to pause here and address the men watching this as well. Because this is not a channel that exists to demonize men or reduce them to villains. A lot of the behavior we're describing, the withdrawal, the testing, the hot and cold patterns, a lot of that is not coming from a place of malice. It's coming from a place of unresolved insecurity. Men who play these kinds of dynamics are often men who are afraid of vulnerability. Men who have learned from past hurt, from cultural conditioning, from watching relationships fail around them, that giving themselves fully to someone is a dangerous thing. So they protect themselves through control. They create distance before intimacy can create risk. And I say this not to excuse the behavior, but to help you understand it. Because when you understand where it comes from, you stop taking it as personally, and you start responding to it from a place of clarity instead of reactivity. Now let's talk about the practical side, because I know some of you are sitting there thinking, okay, great, I understand the psychology, but what do I actually do like right now? in the situation I'm currently in. Here's what you do. First, you stop all outward effort immediately. No checking in. No, hey, I haven't heard from you. No sending him a funny meme to break the ice. No posting something on your story that you know will make him think of you. None of that. You go quiet. Not because you're punishing him, but because you are genuinely redirecting your energy back to yourself, back to your life, back to the things that existed before he became the center of your attention. And I know that's easier said than done. I know that for some of you, the idea of not reaching out feels almost physically uncomfortable. That discomfort is real and it's important. But what it tells you is not that you should reach out. What it tells you is that somewhere in this dynamic, you've given this person more power over your emotional state than they've earned. And that's the thing that needs to change, not for him, but for you. The second thing you do is you fill your time deliberately. This is not about faking happiness or performing a life for social media. This is about genuinely, consciously investing in yourself in the hours and days that would have otherwise been spent waiting for a response or overthinking his last message. You go to that class you've been putting off. You see the friend you've been canceling on. You work on the project that lights you up. You exercise, you rest, you read. You do the things that remind you who you are outside of any relationship. Because here's what happens when you do that. You stop waiting. And when you stop waiting, the anxiety starts to loosen its grip. And when the anxiety loosens, your perspective clears. And you start to see the situation for what it actually is rather than what you fear it might be. I've seen women do this, genuinely redirect their energy inward. And one of two things happens. Either he comes back with a completely different energy because the absence of her chasing made him feel something he didn't expect to feel. Or he doesn't come back. And she realizes somewhere around day 10 or 11 that the absence of his contact no longer stings the way it did. And that's not heartlessness, that's healing. That's her nervous system recalibrating to the truth that her okayness was never dependent on him to begin with. The third thing, and this is the one people most often skip, is that you check in with yourself honestly about what you actually want here. Not what you think you should want. Not what social pressure or romantic fantasy is telling you to want. What do you actually want from this person? Because sometimes when we get still and we stop the anxious chasing and we look at things clearly, we realize that what we were fighting so hard for was never quite what we thought it was. That the version of him we fell for was a projection, who he was on his best days, rather than who he consistently is. And that's important information. On the other hand, sometimes when you get still and honest, you realize that what you have with this person genuinely matters. That underneath the miscommunication and the withdrawal and the anxiety, there is something real worth having a real conversation about. And if that's where you land, the conversation you have after you've recalibrated is completely different from the conversation you would have had in the middle of the anxious spiral. It comes from a grounded place. It comes with clarity. And it's far more likely to actually move something. Which brings me to the fifth angle of this. And it's one I want to spend some real time on because it's the one that separates women who permanently shift the dynamic from women who temporarily fix it, and then find themselves right back in the same place 6 weeks later. And it comes down to this. The moment you reconnect, whenever that is, whether he reaches out or you eventually have something genuine to say, the energy you bring into that reconnection is everything. Because here's what a lot of women do wrong after they've successfully pulled back and he's come back around. They feel relief. And in that relief, they drop back into the old pattern immediately. He texts, you light up. And within 48 hours, you're back to being the one who initiates more, who invests more, who is more available. And then you're confused when the pattern starts again because nothing fundamentally changed. The circumstances changed temporarily, but the dynamic, the underlying give and take of investment slid right back to where it was. What you have to do in that reconnection is hold the energy you found when you were on your own. Not coldly, not with walls up, but with the understanding that your time and attention are still valuable and still need to be earned even now, even with someone you genuinely care about. You can be warm and present and engaged without being the person who carries all the emotional weight of keeping things alive. You can be interested without being anxious. That balance, warm but not desperate, open but not all in from the jump, that is the energy that holds a man's attention over the long term. Not tricks, not games, just the quiet confidence of someone who knows their worth and doesn't feel compelled to prove it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do that right now, because this is exactly the kind of conversation we have on Love Psychology Secrets every single week. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one. Now, I want to address something that I think is hanging in the air for some of you, because I know there are women watching this who have been in these dynamics for a long time, months, maybe years. And the idea of pulling back, of redirecting energy, of letting the silence exist, it might feel impossible because you're so far into it. The pattern is so established. Your nervous system is so wired to the highs and lows of this specific person. And I want to speak directly to that. What you're describing is not weakness. It is not stupidity. It is not some character flaw in you. It is the natural result of what happens when intermittent reinforcement, that hot and cold pattern, gets into your nervous system. Psychologists have studied this for decades. The unpredictable reward schedule is actually the most powerful conditioning there is. It's the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. You don't keep pulling the lever because it always pays out. You keep pulling it because sometimes it does. And the uncertainty of not knowing when is what keeps you hooked. Understanding that about yourself, having genuine compassion for why this is hard without using that compassion as an excuse to stay in it, that is where real change begins. And I will say this plainly. If you are in a dynamic where a man's consistent pattern is to go quiet, resurface when you've pulled back, give you a burst of warmth that makes you think things have shifted, and then slowly fade again, that is not a miscommunication. That is a cycle. And cycles don't break themselves. They break when one person decides they're no longer willing to participate in them. Let me tell you about a pattern I see come up constantly. A woman, let's say her name is Diana. She's been seeing someone for about 4 months. Things felt great in the first month. He was attentive, consistent, texting first, suggesting plans, and then slowly the energy shifted. He started going quiet for a few days at a time. She'd reach out, he'd respond warmly, they'd reconnect, and then the fade would start again. She started adjusting herself to manage the cycle, being more available when he was warm, being careful not to say anything that might trigger another withdrawal, walking on eggshells in a relationship that was supposed to feel like a soft place to land. And she came to me and she said, I don't understand what I'm doing wrong. And I told her, you're not doing anything wrong, but you are doing something that's keeping you trapped. You are making his inconsistency your problem to solve, and it's not. What Diana eventually did, and it wasn't easy, was she stopped managing the cycle and started observing it. She pulled back, not as a strategy to get him back, but as an honest commitment to herself. She decided she would no longer initiate contact for a defined period of time, and she stuck to it. And in that space, she finally saw the pattern clearly for what it was. Not a relationship with rough patches, but a dynamic where she was doing all the emotional heavy lifting and getting intermittent warmth in return. And once she saw that clearly, she knew what she wanted to do. Not from pain, not from anger, from clarity. And she communicated calmly the next time he resurfaced. She told him what she needed. And the way he responded told her everything she needed to know. That is the power you get access to when you stop reacting and start observing. That's the shift. Now, I want to bring something in that I don't think gets talked about enough in these kinds of videos. And it's this. What does any of this mean for how you see yourself after it's all done? Because the goal here is not just to handle this one situation better. The goal is to come out the other side of this as a woman who has a fundamentally different relationship with her own worth, who no longer needs external validation to feel stable, who can be fully, genuinely interested in someone without losing herself in the process. Because that right there is what changes everything about the quality of love you attract going forward. Think about this. When a woman knows herself, when she is grounded in her own life, her own purpose, her own sense of what she deserves, she doesn't stay in cycles very long. Not because she's hard or closed off, but because her tolerance for being treated as an option is genuinely low. Not performatively low, genuinely. She doesn't need to make a speech about her standards because she just lives them. And men who are serious about something real can feel that. It's not a wall they have to scale, it's a calibration. It says, this is someone who takes herself seriously, and I better take her seriously too. That's the version of you that we're working toward. Not the version who wins the game, the version who no longer needs to play it. Let me start bringing this home because there are a few core things I want you to leave this video with. Things I want to land clearly before we close. The first is this. Being ignored by someone you care about does not mean you are lacking. It means you are in a dynamic that is testing your relationship with your own worth. And the way you respond is not just about him. It's about the message you send to yourself about what you're willing to accept. The second thing is this. The most disorienting move you can make from his perspective, from the ego perspective, from the power dynamic perspective, is to simply redirect your energy inward and let the silence be. Not as punishment, but as truth. The truth being that your time is valuable and you have plenty of meaningful ways to invest it that do not involve waiting on someone who isn't showing up. The third thing, love and a relationship are not the same thing. You can love someone sincerely and still be in a dynamic that does not serve you. You can have real feelings for a person and still recognize that what the two of you have built together is not matching the quality of those feelings. Being honest about that distinction, being willing to hold both things at once, is some of the most mature emotional work a person can do. And finally, the goal is never to break a man's ego for sport. The title of this video is provocative on purpose, because I know that word ego caught your attention. But what we're really talking about is something much more important than ego breaking. We're talking about refusing to be conditioned. Refusing to let someone's inconsistency train your nervous system into anxiety. Refusing to make their emotional unavailability your problem to fix. When you do that, when you hold that line with genuine calm and real self-respect, you don't break his ego. You break the dynamic. And that is what actually changes things. Go do that. Go reclaim your energy. Go invest in yourself so deeply that the idea of chasing someone who goes cold starts to feel genuinely foreign to who you are. Because that version of you, she doesn't need this video. She already knows. If this hit home for you today, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, where are you in this? Have you been in a dynamic like this? Have you already come out the other side? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read.